Hey everyone, it's Reed. You've heard me say it before, and I'm going to say it again. I need you to go to jointheunion.us and get involved today. Guys, the future of the country is on the line in the coming days, weeks, months, and years, and your voice, your heart, your hands are what we need. Go to jointheunion.us and get involved in the work today. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by Lauren Groh-Wargo, the CEO of the national voting rights organization, Fair Fight Action. Prior to Fair Fight, she served as campaign manager for Stacey Abrams' Georgia gubernatorial campaign and began her career organizing against slumlords in Brooklyn, New York. Today, she's coming to us from Atlanta, Georgia. Lauren, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Reed. Excited to be here.
I think you and I went about 5 years between emails. We talked like in 2020 during the Georgia Senate runoffs post November 2020. And then we saw each other just a few weeks ago at an event in New York City, and we started talking about another event you had attended where it was a lot of bigwig Democrats, a lot of bigwig donors. We'll leave the particulars out. But the point was, you said there was this elephant in the room that no one seemed to be really willing to either A, accept, or B, even acknowledge existed. And this was all in the context of the 2026 midterms. And what you said is basically, why do you think that the 2026 midterms are going to go like they've always gone, just because that's what we're used to? And in fact, I put something similar to that in the latest thing I wrote, but give us a sense, one, of why you believe that, where we are, and what do you think needs to happen. And there are a few things about the Help America Vote Act and the sort of particulars I want to get into, but just give us a sense of how you see the world at this moment.
Thanks, Reed. Well, I think your audience knows better than most that the Trump MAGA movement has always been an anti-democracy movement and has been norm busting at a level that we've never really seen in contemporary American politics. And how I view it is sort of an unholy matrimony between what I would call sort of traditional voter suppression that we've seen from Republicans and historically coming out of Jim Crow, blocking the ballot in a series of ways, creating confusion around locations, dismantling the Voting Rights Act. And then you have this sort of hyper wackadoodle, souped up MAGA Trump, Cleta Mitchell stew of break elections, right? And try to engineer them so that any victory that is not theirs is invalidated. So we've all lived through the insurrection. And then in 2021, our country saw more voter suppression bills moved in state legislatures than any other time in our history, except for 2023. So now, as we move to 2026, we are seeing the onslaught. Where are we? Week 6 of the Trump administration. We are seeing a panoply of autocratic maneuvers, radical legal theories being advanced, the unitary executive. I assume you've talked about that on the show. And all of this is gearing up towards a midterm election. And so when I saw you in New York, right, we have a PAC and a C4. My PAC I'm in a lot of capital D Democratic sort of elite circles, you could say. And there's this tension, right? Like, oh, 2018 was a, quote, good year for Democrats, right? And the backlash to Trump. And so there's this conversation going on. Is 2026 going to be like that, but even more accelerated, that new opportunities are going to open up? My view on this is everything is premature. Yes, there's going to be backlash to Trump, no doubt. But we are seeing a coordinated assault on elections as intense as this flurry of EOs and dismantling federal government. There is a plan they are executing on that just hasn't really gotten a lot of attention yet because elections are far off, right? And we have all these other crises of the moment. So how elections are run in the midterm is, in my view, the biggest sort of question for our future. And is the will of the people going to be heard? And we are seeing coming into this year, right, the Trump operation in a dark, anti-democratic, autocratic way had a really effective 4 years out of power, right? There's been lots written about this. They really tripled down on the Orban playbook and understanding what they could put in place, laying out litigation, state legislative and federal activities, all buoyed by disinformation and propaganda, so that the courts are already they're stacked with anti-democratic election bills that are going to come. We can get into that. They are coming on the backs of omnibus voter suppression bills having been passed in a lot of states that change the way election roll maintenance goes, machines go, paper ballots go, giving access to the anti-democratic MAGA nuts to get into election administration, right? They've already set all of those tables. And so now you see the federal piece coming in. The way I think about it is Cleta Mitchell and her operation have laid out their Elections Bill of Rights this year. That is the simplest place to understand what this playbook is. It's the lie of voter fraud and the SAVE Act, which we can get into, which is starting to move in Congress, which we can get into that. It's the federal funding freeze, which HAVA and other related funds, Help America Vote Act, is granting money to the states for them to have elections and do election security. We can get more into that. And it's to basically say anything that's not election day voting is fraudulent, and to get rid of mail voting, early voting, late ballot receipts. And so those are the pieces that are going while they start to socialize some of their other radical and fringe ideas. So that's kind of the moment we are in. And all of that is going to gear up to what I believe they are trying to tee up, which is an unfair election. The good news is we know what they're doing. It's out in plain sight. It's not hidden, just like Project 2025 wasn't hidden. Some of it was there. And then the other piece is the dismantling of our federal government and the implications for election. I'm sure the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Act, CISA, was essentially gutted. And that goes to sort of what they're doing on the dismantling side right now. That is the agency that has been responsible for mitigating disinformation in our elections. And there's a specific Russia tie there as well. So those are sort of the pieces. We can go into whichever ones you're most interested in. But that's the table that we're kind of sitting at right now, and what we're going to see sort of expand and spool out over the course of this year, moving into next year.
There's a lot to break down there, so let me break it into a few bullets. The first piece is you went back to 2021, and I have often thought and said, as you indicated, that the post-election Republican Party, for them, January 6th was not an endpoint, but a beginning, right? This is where they started to take all of the things that they claimed were unfair, that they claimed had cost Trump the election, and they started to move on those legislatively. And in some ways, and we've seen this throughout history, Lauren, and I know that you in Georgia have been at the forefront of this, on the front lines of this, is they actually use the democratic process to dismantle the democratic process, to make it more and more difficult for otherwise normal voters to participate. I mean, there's the whole Larry David last season where the whole joke is that he gets arrested for giving somebody a bottle of water in a voting line on a hot day. That was the whole thing. And obviously, he's a comedic genius, so it made that whole piece look ridiculous. But again, if you are somebody who is standing in line, if it's a primary or whatever, it's very warm and no one can hand you water, the intention there is to get you to leave. And there's so many other things. Let's talk about Cleta Mitchell. Cleta Mitchell, for all of those who don't recall, is the woman, back to Georgia, who is on the phone, the lawyer who is on the phone with Donald Trump in December of 2020 saying, we just need 11,230 votes, whatever it was. She has subsequently gone through a 501c3, a charitable organization, to go through why, if someone says they are pro-democracy, small d democracy, they are not your friend. And this whole ridiculous stuff. And guys, this is where words matter. If someone says we're a democracy, you say we're not, we're a republic. And all of these words getting to places where a republic could be anything. North Korea is a republic. China is a republic, right? They even call it the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, DPRK, whatever it is. The point is, like, they start to change the meaning of these words on purpose. And she is out there again with their various things. I know that the Heritage Foundation has a very, very sophisticated operation of, where they either send their own lobbyists in to get any voting bills in, or they identify really creepy sort of 1984, what they call sentinels, right? People that they ask their legislator to carry this kind of legislation. And so I think back to one thing that you noted, Lauren, is we should never forget how effective and efficient the totality of this operation is. It's all in coordinated fashion. It's all complementary to one another. It's always got plenty of resources. And now I think to this point is they see 2026 as, well, do I think that Donald Trump really cares about the House of Representatives? I don't think he does. I don't think he cares about any individual member of Congress. But for them, it's the cherry on top of dismantling everything else, which is they're going to do whatever they're going to do, whoever holds the U.S. House. But if they can make it easier, to your point, and then the last piece is all of this stuff goes along with the other part that you mentioned, which is the misinformation, the disinformation, the propaganda, the 24/7, 365 piece of this, which goes on unfettered and uninterrupted from this moment until November of 2026. And so even if Republicans are doing bad things, which they are already doing and will do more of, the chance for otherwise normal voters to hear that is very clouded. And then we've got Democrats in disarray, but we don't have to get into that right this second. But let me ask one question about something that you mentioned specifically when we saw each other. So tell us how the Help America Vote Act works, why the funding it provides to states is so essential, and without that funding, it makes it that much more difficult to get voters to show up.
The core foundation of this entire anti-democratic onslaught is the lie of voter fraud. And the lie of voter fraud has always been the lie of voter suppression. If you think back to Jim Crow, all the attacks on Black voters was that they were unclean voters, unsavory voters, right? That there were these voters that don't deserve. That remains the core of it. And this idea that all these non-citizen illegal immigrants are voting is one plank of it. This idea that non-election day votes are part of it, right? That people are stuffing ballots, right? So if you understand that the core is the lie of voter fraud, then everything starts to make sense. That's how they build the foundation of their house. So anything then that is helping increase election security and help the running of elections, you would think would be supported by this Trump operation if they're so concerned about all of these, quote, illegal voters. But it's actually the opposite, right? It's the Orwellian thing you've said on their other issues. They counterintuitively are starving elections. They're trying to get the outcome they want by passing unfunded mandates in the state and then starving elections to try to get rid of access. Why? And this goes to answer your question. I promise I'm getting there. Because the number one way to suppress the vote is reduce polling locations, reduce hours, get lines longer so people leave and do not vote. The number one most effective way to get voter suppression executed is a long line. And there are all these ways you can do it. So that's then how you get back to the funding on the HAVA side and the election security on the HAVA side and on the CISA side. So the Help America Vote Act has been around for a while. It was reinvigorated, and it's a grant program. It's a drawdown grant program to states. And depending on how states access that money, so, looking at like by what metric, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars to a state like Georgia. Georgia's a state of around 11 million, right? And the HAVA funding breaks down into a couple different buckets. There's election improvement to improve voter registration systems, upgrading systems, that kind of like technology work. There's a bucket on election security grants, on all things cybersecurity, on voting processes, voting equipment, physical security, cybersecurity, all things security. Then there's some CARES Act funding that came via HAVA that does all kinds of stuff. There's helping disabled voters get access, making sure through the pandemic folks got additional funds to run elections. So there's all these different categories within HAVA, and states are accessing them in different ways. So what happened when the federal funding freeze hit, it created chaos for election administrators. If they hadn't drawn down their money yet, are they going to be able to draw it down? there was press coverage that the money they had already drawn down now that they weren't allowed to spend, right? We know chaos and confusion is the number one weapon of historic and modern autocrats and of this administration. So states are all talking to each other. We're getting reports that folks are just confused. In some states, this is the entire money to ensure that folks are following the American Disabilities Act. What does that mean? That there's ramps at your location, that there's signage, right? That there's additional equipment. So HAVA funding and the confusion around that, and then obviously then it gets litigated. And then just everybody needs to it's all up here. Just think about your county where you live and your local election administrator. Some of these are part-time jobs. Some of these are volunteer, depending on how rural you are. They're like looking at little budget sheets and just trying to figure out how they're going to run elections next year, right? What money do I have left over from last year? What's my crazy state legislature doing on elections this year, right? What money am I going to have for next year? How am I going to plan for that? And so it creates this chaos and uncertainty, and that persists, right? Because a lot of this is now, including the federal funding freeze, caught up in litigation. Number two, just like HAVA, the CISA, which is the cyber security money, they gutted that agency. One of the really horrible things that happened in 2024 that I only talk about on a limited basis when I have time, like today, there were bomb threats that the federal government, CISA, said were tied to Russia in Black, Latino, and Native American precincts in about 6 states at a minimum across at least 67 polling locations on election day in 2024. That was a coordinated false call in and email. Russia eventually. Who handled that? Why was there not chaos on election day? Because CISA had planned all of this with election administrators, had done all the pre work, had a communication system with them. So as they're coming in, there's a reporting system. So there's not a bunch of election administrators going on Fox News or on local TV saying, oh my God, oh my God. So it had a suppressive effect. We know that locally. We've done some research on the impact. But CISA kept the waters calm. That agency has now been gutted. So when you start looking at what does that mean for next year, first of all, we're giving carte blanche to Russia to invade our elections, right? By stripping cybersecurity money overall. We know there have been hostile entries, at least on bomb threats, most recently. And then this idea on fighting disinformation, gutting the disinformation mitigation of our federal government. And this is where the Trump team, we can see it in the way they're extorting media companies by forcing them to pay Trump. This is all about corruption and paying your fealty, your corruption fee to Trump. And it's also to weaponizing propaganda at a new level. Because what they say and what Elon Musk says is that any labeling of anything as disinformation is censorship. And so by dismantling the disinformation mitigation around elections, they're saying they're preventing censorship. What they're actually doing is giving carte blanche to very bad actors who are trying to chill our American democracy. And it's very dangerous. So there are solutions here. We're going to get to solutions, Reed.
Right.
Please promise me, because this
We
is scary
absolutely.
stuff, but we got to take it very, very seriously because no one's coming to save us here, to quote your last Substack around the Zelensky fight. But this is our democracy and it's very participatory. So there are lots of ways we can get involved. But this is very, very serious business in terms of just dismantling all of the architecture we have to support election administration in the states.
Let me break down a few of the things you said. As we're recording this, it was revealed over the weekend that now Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth had ordered a stand-on of all offensive cyber operations against Russia, right? So anything we were doing to push back as a government, even on a national security basis, that's now gone. As you said, they have gutted CISA. It's not long before they will probably turn the fire hose or maybe the garden hose of CISA on Americans as opposed to protecting us. In Texas, I believe it was the 2021 legislative session, I think, remember, where they said because of security, we have to have only one drop box per county. Now, if you live in Fort Bend County, that's a long, long drive, so that's a pain. But if you live in Harris County, right? Which has got to be what, 5 or 6 million people, and there's only one drop box, right? That's its own problem in of itself. Just to stay in Texas too, remember that they made the penalties for election workers harsher than they did for quote unquote election observers who were disruptive. And then take it to my home state in Utah, where I live, and the legislative session here, where we have all mail voting, right? There's no, there, I mean, you can drop it off at a box and you can take it to your county, whatever. But like, we don't have election day voting. They're now saying maybe we need to get rid of that. They're going to get rid of election day registration. But the other part too is, having this idea of, Lauren, making sure that we clarify through legislation that non-citizens are not allowed to vote. And I think this is one that particularly irks me because, again, it goes against logic, which is if you are here as an undocumented immigrant, person, whatever, the last thing you're going to do, like if you're just trying to get by, is go and intentionally commit a felony, right? Where everybody's standing around. Right? Like, this just doesn't make any sense. Not to mention, I think you might have noted earlier, there's no evidence of it. But I think that's the broader part of this too, which is there's no evidence for any of this. And let me just say one last thing that you mentioned vis-a-vis COVID in 2020 is they will now use COVID was always a hoax, and it was a hoax, and we shouldn't have done this. And this is what the Democrats did to account for it. And this is why they won, which is why 2020 was rigged. Right. So again, as guys, as you're listening to this, all of these things, these tendrils, they're experts at tying all of these things together so that, Lauren, to your point, people are either confused, upset, frustrated, think none of it matters anyway, or they're angry, so they do show up, or they're completely dispirited and they don't show up. And usually the people who are angry to show up are now, as we've seen in too many cases, outnumbering the people who are dispirited.
It's so true. And as an aside, this is why podcasts and media like this is actually more important than ever before. We have the Washington Post has become a subsidiary entity of the White House. I mean, that's why using our voice is so powerful. And to that point, we have a crisis of participation in this country. Part of the reason Donald Trump won is were 34.5 million more eligible non-voters in 24 over 20. 34.5 million people more decided not to participate. And there were 31 million more eligible voters in 24 over 20. So our country and our eligible voter pool is growing, but our participation is down. And you look at how that goes across states, and you can really see that the disinformation to Democratic, capital D, Democratic leaning voters, the disinformation is mainly around dispiriting people to get them to stay home. Voter suppression in this country looks like not all these laws and practices in confusion and underfunding, the lie of voter fraud, but it also looks like an intentional propaganda effort to divide us, to tell us our vote doesn't matter, to tell us that Democrats suck and that we shouldn't vote for them, to get people to stay home. And unfortunately, a lot of those strategies did work in 2024. It's part of the story, obviously not the whole story.
Right. You don't need poll taxes and billy clubs if you've already convinced them to stay home long before they ever get to the polling place.
That's right. And we actually did research post-election. I have one of the few times I've actually been able to do this, Reed. You would appreciate this as an operative. We got a big survey into the field before Christmas to voters in North Carolina, Georgia, and then across the rest of the South. We did all races, but we oversampled Black folks. 15% of Black voters in the South report having a physical barrier to voting. ID issue, polling place issue, intimidation. That is the margin in a state like Georgia when we're close elections. These have real tangible impacts. And then I want to go back to another sort of foundational piece that's happening underneath us, which is the increasingly the sort of miasma of criminal prosecution that's being put on voting. This lie that non-citizens are voting. It does not happen. Only citizens can vote in federal elections. We don't need to be passing all the state laws that they're doing. We don't need a new federal statute that's already the law. There's zero evidence that this is a problem. But what they're doing is they're taking it a step further. In all those voter suppression state bills in Georgia and Texas, they've started putting criminal penalties onto what might be accidental mistakes around voting. and also just to scare people. So they've got criminal penalties if you erroneously mark somebody else's ballot. If it's no longer just a mistake, it's criminal penalties. The SAVE Act, which we haven't yet talked about, which will be moving soon in Congress, which came from Cleta Mitchell. She said in one of her election network calls that God put it on her heart to write that bill. And this bill is about the lie of non-citizen voting. They were trying to make it sound like an immigration bill, but it is a straight up brutal voter suppression bill that the Brennan Center nonpartisan group estimates would disenfranchise around 21 million Americans. And it requires one of three different forms of ID to register to vote or to re-register to vote. And if the election official screws up the registration and doesn't properly account for these, criminal penalties on the election administrator. So the chilling effect here is very intense. Should the SAVE Act pass, we hope that it will be defeated. It is bad for Republicans. It is bad for Democrats. It would require one of the three. Here are the three, Reed. You need your original birth certificate, your military paperwork, or a passport. And then if you don't have one of the three, you have to sign this affidavit. Okay. But because of the criminal penalties, what election official is going to take a signed affidavit? This is facially bonkers and would be hilarious if it weren't so serious. Think about all the women who changed their name but aren't in the military and don't have a passport. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to do this affidavit. Okay, that is, very problematic. So that's one piece of it. But I pulled the numbers in Georgia. We have automatic voter registration here. In the past couple of years, I think since 2021, my data was, over 500,000 Republicans have gotten registered. It's a little bit more Democrats have gotten registered. Those Republicans, for the most part, do not have passports. They are not in the military. And I don't know, Reed, could you tell me right now where your birth certificate is? Because I've been actually trying to, ever since this passed, I was like, where is my birth certificate?
I am nerdy enough to know that, yes, I actually do know exactly where it is,
I'm glad you know where your birth certificate is.
but that's
Yeah.
neither here nor there.
So that's what the SAVE Act is about. And it also allows better and better from their point of view, bigger voter purges. And so we're seeing this move at the national level. So that's one thing you can do right away as we start to move to action is call your member of Congress and call your U.S. Senator this week and say, do not pass the voter cancel act known as the quote SAVE Act. It is bad for Republicans. It's bad for Democrats. It's bad for independents. It's bad for our democracy. So that is one of the fights that you're going to hear. It's going to be the first big, I think, elections fight that we're going to get in this new Trump administration because it's expected to start moving through Congress here in the next couple of weeks. And so that is going to be a big area we're looking because it would fundamentally change voter registration. It would get rid of online voter registration. It would get rid of automatic voter registration.
So let me ask you this, because our friends down in Florida, Mi Vecino, I think, they've done a lot of voter registration in heavily Latino populations, nonpartisan registration. And at some point, I don't remember if it was in 21 or 22, DeSantis and the legislature down there changed how a voter registration card could be filled out, how it could be turned in. But the legislature didn't provide any guidance to the local elections officials. So half the time they were like, I don't know if I'm supposed to accept the new one or the old one. I don't even know if I like the new one. I'm not even sure how it works. And so to your point, and, I used to run ballot measures for a living, and this was the same part, just like ballot measures, right? Confusion equals no. Right? Confusion equals a negative or a non-response. And that's exactly what this is. It's no different. To your point, like it's that 5 or 8% more, and I'm just making that up off the top of my head, Lauren, where it makes someone who otherwise would participate throw their hands up and say, it doesn't matter anyway.
I agree with you. And the SAVE Act and some of these other sort of what I would call zany but now very serious ideas fundamentally changes how we think of participating in our democracy. We think in our democracy that like the NAACP could do a voter reg drive, a Latino group could go. How are you going to do a voter reg drive if you have to give a copy of your personal identifying information to a local volunteer? You're not going to do it, right? So third-party voter registration drives, they are obviously trying to kill off. That is one of, I would say, sort of a hallmark of our democracy, like basic level organizing, just like ballot initiatives and other pieces. And that if you go back to what Cleta Mitchell and her, I don't want to overemphasize her because it's a whole huge network of people, they want to get rid of and outlaw. They want to outlaw the popular vote movement, the movement to get rid of 270 and just to allow a popular vote. They want to get rid of efforts to do ranked choice voting, any kind of small d democracy initiatives. They want to say no, and they want to see the only thing that's lawful is election day voting. They filed litigation in multiple states last year, Reed, to try to throw out ballots that were received after Election Day from military voters and overseas voters. That used to be something that they would, and nobody would ever touch. No one would ever touch the concept that a military voter could have a ballot received and counted when it came the couple days after Election Day. Those were shot down. But the point is, just like we saw with abortion access, eventually with Dobbs, what we've seen with the Voting Rights Act, what we've seen with our fundamental rights, they run a multi-track strategy, including a strategic litigation strategy, along with all of the legislative and others to try to fundamentally change precedent in our country. That's what we're dealing with. Now, the good news is that the federal government doesn't run elections. Our local community runs elections, and that is going to be the way we have to get in serious formation, which is why I'm very glad we're having this conversation in Q1 of 2025, because democracy is not going to be a spectator sport at a whole new level next year. People of goodwill who care about our democracy are going to need to get engaged in this next year, because nobody thinks that the Trump world's going to wait 4 years. They're going to use next year to innovate and practice and try to socialize their crazy ideas as we look towards the even wackier things they're starting to socialize around a Trump third term and everything else going forward.
Well, because they're sure as heck acting like he's not going anywhere, right? They're sure as heck acting like I got nothing to worry about because, look, this whole idea of like polling and all that, like, yeah, okay, things are unpopular, right? People are upset. Like, that's the nature of American voters today. But he doesn't care, right? To your point, like Elon Musk doesn't care. The rest of these people don't care. I think that's the other part too is, you talked about ranked choice voting and those things. I've worked on a lot of those issues over the years. I think unfortunately sometimes too, because of the nature of how they work, it could be open primaries also, the Democratic Party isn't always a huge fan of them too, because they are market entrants, one of two largely market entrants. And so it can be very difficult to tell someone who is a dedicated partisan operator, look, you got to make it easy for new people or people that you don't necessarily choose to get involved. Like, I get it intellectually, but that's one thing. And then the other part is this idea that 71% of Republican office holders last year ran unopposed, right? So it's not just a matter of whether or not it's harder to vote, but I think you tell me, Lauren, because you are part of the sort of big D Democratic establishment. If Democrats don't have someone to vote for locally, they might not show up at all. Right. And so I think that this is both a top down and a bottom up set of solutions, which is you have to do all you can to stymie these efforts, whether it's in Washington, D.C. or a state capital. And then a little bit further down, you have to be working as hard as you can in the state you live in. Then you have to go recruit. And this is one of the things we're doing at the union to make sure that no one runs unopposed to the extent that's possible. Right. And if you look at these maps, guys, that are available, and I'll find it, Rob, and I'll put it in the show notes. You see some of these states where it's like, yeah, 55, 60, 70, 80% of people run unopposed. Like, that's not democracy either, right? And I do believe, I was telling somebody this, I think that the beauty of having an R or a D behind your name, regardless of how you feel about it, is it's always been shorthand. If you see an R, it gives you a sense of this. If you see a D, it gives you a sense of this. Now, those, of course, have moved and they continue to move over time. But the thing it gets you, Lauren, is it gets you to like to 45 or 46 right off the bat, right? Ballot access is an enormous, enormous asset, but we have to start taking advantage of it on the pro-democracy side so that when we have the opportunity to put somebody up, we do that as opposed to just saying, oh, it's an R+15 district, we can't possibly win. No, maybe you can't. But if you get 2,000 or 3,000 otherwise Democratic voters out that would not have otherwise shown up, you can now start to move things in places and in ways you couldn't possibly have understood.
I am generally an optimistic person. And so what my belief for next year is we should be running aggressively, comprehensively, deeply, running folks everywhere in case we get a lightning strike. and can really have a big sweep of pro-democracy folks nationwide. And if you don't think that's possible, well, let me introduce you to former Governor John Bell Edwards, who no one ever thought would win a gubernatorial, but then ran against David Vicker, just was at the right time, the right opponent. Same thing with Doug Jones in Alabama. Those are Senate and gubernatorial races, but there are many examples locally, even in extreme gerrymandering, where if it's a lightning strike year combined with an opponent who's never had an opponent, a lot could happen. So that is one area folks should seriously be considering running for local office, not only to win and to advance a policy, but to give you a platform to be part of the solution here, just generally to show more young people and to show our community that elected officials can work on behalf of folks and use their voice. Because sometimes I believe right now, the deep local organizing combined with using our voice, it's gonna get us through this. It's not, like, gonna fix everything, but to your point, we have to have sort of these mitigation strategies in capitals at the federal level. We can't expect the courts to save us. We're gonna win some stuff, but we're mostly gonna lose some stuff because we have an extreme Federalist Society takeover of the courts. That doesn't mean we don't use that tool.
No, but also it takes a long time, and as we've seen, the judiciary doesn't have an enforcement mechanism. So, it can say, "You have to do this," and it could be a Secretary of State in Arkansas, they're like, "No, not gonna do it."
Their enforcement mechanism is us, right? It's us saying that we've had enough, either voting people out or protesting or withholding our economic power or our labor. There's all of these recent and historic examples of that. But I think for pivoting to solutions, I hope what folks take away, number one, think about running for office. Number two, elections are run locally. Donald Trump does not run your local election. He can starve it of funding, he can intimidate people, but he does not actually run elections. So the biggest call to action I have, especially a year and a half out from the midterm, is go get involved in your local board of elections, your county supervisors, they call them different things. The anti-democracy folks show up at every one of those meetings. I don't care if you live in the bluest county in Connecticut or California, they are there and they are advocating against voting access. You need to get your butt in those meetings to stand with your pro-voting folks and to get involved. And then you need to be a poll worker. And you also need to consider if you should be running some of these local elections boards or county supervisors are elected positions. Many of them are partisan. The Democrats get a couple, the Republicans get a couple. Every county in the country works differently, but there is a participation by the locals element of it. And the bad guys, the anti-democracy folks, are organizing in all of these places. So there is a community locally for you of pro-democracy folks, never Trumper Republicans, independents, Democrats, all kinds of folks who are working on this. You're not going to be alone. And that is a number one way to get involved. Show up at those meetings, become a poll worker, get to know, and that small d democracy work in your community is going to be what carries us through next year, ultimately, because they cannot stop that local organizing. So it seems so basic, but if every single county in our country, or parish if you're in Louisiana, or whatever your locality is, if in every place there are pro-democracy folks doing that work, that is the work of our democracy, and we will be able to see it through. If everybody throws up their hands and just scrolls on their phone and just, stays in their algorithm, we are in for a whole world of problem, right? And so that's why the functioning of our democracy, that's why organizations like Fair Fight exist. A lot of what we do, Reed, is our nonpartisan side works with other nonpartisan orgs and election administrators to get poll workers there, right? We do really basic voter education, when to vote, how to vote. We started the first ever voter education chat bot. We controlled the back end to make it, we call her Peaches. And she'll tell you, oh, sweet tea, Reed Galen. If you try to ask her about Trump, I don't care who you vote for, Reed. I just want you to vote. Right. So there are so many positive, proactive ways we can do that. So that is my call to action. And then throw down if things are moving through your legislature, your county, or your locality, or the federal government, you got to make your voice heard. Voter suppression is targeted at disproportionately Black communities, young communities, rural communities. But the problem with voter suppression is it impacts everybody. I mean, Reed, we collect stories. We get stories from Republicans who were part of a mass challenge. Mass challenges tend to go to Democratic leaning voters. But when you make mass challenge laws, that's when any citizen can say, Reed, I don't believe you should be registered to vote and start a legal process in your county. But they do it for hundreds or thousands of folks. Republicans get caught up in this. Independents get caught up in this. Military veterans get caught. It's bad. The attacks on the democracy are fundamentally bad for everybody. And so that's why we really need broad, diverse communities linking hands and pushing back hard and doing it with the American flag behind them, like Reed, being proud of our country. This is what our country is about. Our democracy's always been fraught about who is in and who is out, who is part of our democracy. And so we really having that sort of North Star of like, we can have a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. We can do this. We're going to go through some really hard times, but like, we know that that's really important and doable.
I want to say a couple things. One is to the last point. Yes, like guys, this is doable, but remember a couple of things. One, we're up against some very bad people with a lot of resources and a massive media organization, right? But even with all that, they just barely won. Okay. Second, they've been at this for 50 years, right? Like we have to take the 24/7, 365, call it organizing, call it work piece of this to heart. They never stop. We can't either. And then to your point about the local stuff, we've seen some, Republican members of Congress just getting pilloried at their town halls, and now the Republican leadership is saying, just don't do them. Okay, well, like the member of Congress can run back to Washington. There's not a lot their constituents can do. But I'll tell you this, school boards, county councils, county commissions, they live where you live. I promise you, like, if enough of you show up like they did in the town I live in a few years ago to push back on a developer where they were ready to push through a really bad deal for the county, right? And 3 or 400 of us showed up and everybody spoke for 3 minutes. Like they backed off because they realized, oh gosh, we can't do this. And now 4 years later, of course, they capitulated. It's a whole other thing we're working on. But the point is that like they don't like that kind of pressure. It makes them very, very uncomfortable. And to your point, Lauren, they're going to see at the grocery store. They're going to see at the baseball game. They're going to see at the band of Palooza at the middle school. And they don't want that, right? They don't want that. And not only that, like everybody knows you. So when election time comes around, there's a really good chance, also a lot of these are nonpartisan, that it only takes one person who goes, look, I'm going to be learning on the job on this, blah, 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 but I'm not that guy. I'm not the guy that sold us out. And a lot of times, these things come down to a few dozen votes, not thousands or tens of thousands.
It's so true. I think about the Trump MAGA takeover of the Georgia State Election Board last year. It got a lot of press. I don't know if you covered
Right?
that on the
Mhm.
show or
Sure, of
not,
course.
Reed, but they really thought they were just going to ram through a bunch of extreme and draconian, very late election changes. They had every local election administrator in state screaming at them. They got multiple court challenges from Democrats, from Republicans. They had a massive amount of people showing up at their meetings. They had huge pushback. And it, through a whole variety of means, shut the whole thing down, right? And I think there are these moments where they also overplay their hands. They put not so bright people into positions of power, and there's so much corruption in all of this that some of it you can really poke, right? Some of it got poked on the state election board. Well, it turns out one of the guys was just trying to get into an eventual Trump cabinet, and somebody caught him saying that, right? There's a lot of that going on. The Trump world is full of grift and full of corruption.
It's all predicated on that, actually.
Foundationally, it's about avoiding jail time for Trump. I've been spending a lot of time with Ruth Ben-Ghiat. If you haven't read her book,
Sure.
Strongman,
Brilliant.
read it. But it's all about, being above the rule of law and lining their pockets. And so all of their acolytes are in that grift with them. And so a little bit of pushback and a little bit of strategery really goes a long way here. And so, look, we're gearing up for a fight like we've never seen on the fundamental machinery of elections. We've learned a lot the past couple years, and there's a long history of this in our country. This is not new. It's just sort of the modern autocratic Trump version of it.
The wheel sort of spins back around every like 60 years, huh?
That's right. And I think there's a lot we can learn from what's gone on in Europe recently and others in terms of how do we be a really good opposition party. There's no one answer to this. And, to reiterate, no one's coming to save us. So we have to think about what we can do in our communities to fight back. And if you're not sure, Listen to Reed's podcast, sign up for a fair fight, get involved in an organization and in media outlets that can give you some good calls to action, because the other thing they're trying to do is overwhelm us all. And I'm seeing that with my friends and network. I'm sure you are too, Reed, who are sort of outside the sector, totally overwhelmed.
For sure. A lot of people just turning their phones off altogether. Yeah.
Or if they're tuned in too much, they're having like anxiety and all this stuff. So, you know, titrate your imbibement of the propaganda machine, but get involved with organizations that can give you some clear calls to action, or just pick an issue or two that you can go whole hog. I feel like this moment, a lot of people are sort of frozen and overwhelmed or scared. Like I got a lot of friends at the CDC right now, Reed, who are doing international polio work and not allowed to talk to anybody anymore. How terrifying, right? The personal networks here, people are really feeling this broadly in our country.
Well, and a friend of mine told me just yesterday, he's a virologist, and said that a friend of his at the CDC said that the advisory board that chooses the flu vaccine got canceled at the last second. So good luck in flu season 2025, everybody, because it's going to feel like West Texas out here next winter. All right. Lauren, before we let you go, where can we find you? Where can we find Fair Fight? And what else do we need to know?
So I'm both on Blue Sky and I'm still on Elon's Twitter. So you can find Lauren GW. GW Lauren is my handle. You can go to Fair Fight. We're on all the social media threads, including Instagram and all of those. And then you can go sign up for our email on fairfight.com to get all of our information. And we do regular briefings and updates. If you give us a little bit of money, you'll get even more out of us. But we need volunteers and folks. We work most deeply in the South, and so Georgia and across the traditional South, and then we leverage our networks nationally. And so yeah, that's the best way to get involved with us. And then I really encourage folks. We have really strong coalition allies in the civil rights community and that space, as well on our PAC side on the political space. So it's going to be a big fight. We're going to have a lot of elections next year. There's going to be a lot of opportunity. Next year could be a really positive year where we start to check the Trump administration, but we cannot take anything for granted. And no one should feel comfortable thinking this is just going to be some Democratic wave with what they are doing. We're going to have to do more. We have a lot of important Senate races on the ballot next year. And this is another one, Read, for your argument. There are some really tough states, but we need good people to run in those states, and we need folks to get involved in all those Senate races. So start to sort of track that as well. But that's where we are. We're on all the social media, Fair Fight and GW Lauren, and we'd love to hear from y'all. You can tweet us, you can Blue Sky us, if you have questions, and really grateful for the time on your show, Reed. I'm really grateful that you're digging in on this.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Lauren. And as always, gang, you can find me still on Twitter, TikTok, and says.us, SEZ.us, at Reed Galen, on Threads and Instagram at Reed_Galen USA. And of course, always check out my Substack, also called The Home Front. Guys, take Lauren's advice, take my pleadings, get involved where you live. Do not spend all your time banging your head against a wall about what's going on in Washington, D.C. Get involved locally, get involved today. Lauren Groh-Wargo, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, Reed. Have a great week.
And everybody else, we'll see you next time.